In 1466, a man from Tver, modern-day Russia, named Afanasy Nikitin decided he was going to travel down to the Caucasus to exploit the recent peacetime in the area and make some money as a merchant. He would never return home. Afanasy, with a few other merchants, did most of the first part of the journey along the Volga River, which runs through Russia and drains into the Caspian Sea. His first stop was at an Orthodox Christian monastery in Kalyazin, where he received a blessing for his journey by the Abbot Makary before continuing down to Uglik and then Kostroma. This was at the edge of the extent of Tver's power, and he was now entering the Grand Principality of Moscow. They kept on this river down to Nizhny Novgorod, and they were let through unhindered. He went looking for a man called Vasily Papin, an ambassador from Moscow who was going to the same place he was, Shawan, but just missed him by a few weeks, so instead waited for the returning ambassador to come through, called Hassan Beg, who was bringing 90 Falcons back to Shavan, and they together passed through Kazan, Sarai, which was the capital of the remains of the Golden Horde, and Berekazani, all unhindered. Then, in their two boats, they continued on an arm of the Volga, the river Buzan, when they came across what he calls free pagan Tartars, who said their Sultan, Qasim, leader of the Khanate of Astrakhan, who controlled this region, was looking for merchants, and he had 3,000 Tartars with him. Hassan Beg, being a bit more well versed in this world, gave each of them a fancy coat and some linen, so they could guide them through Astrakhan. They took these, but slipped away and told their leader anyways, and quickly Afanasy and the others from Tver boarded Hassan Beg's ship, quickly transferring all their goods to it. Hassan's was a bit smaller, so they planned on getting through in the night quietly, but sadly the warriors at Astrakhan were prepared, and as they passed they shouted, "Do not flee!" And their small ship couldn't break a few fishing piles that were under the river, and straight away the warriors overtook the ship and plundered it. Afanasy was robbed, and he simply says, "All my cargo was on the smaller ship." They then tried to get through on the larger ship, but it ran aground closer to the mouth of the river Volga, and the Astrakhans dragged them back and seized the larger ship, as well as 4 Russians before letting them go to sea, completely robbed. And with the warning that they weren't allowed back up the river, back home, in case they told merchants and travellers coming down the river what lay before them in Astrakhan. They were given both their ships back, and this time Afanasy stuck with Hassan and a few Russians and Persians, the other ship filled with the rest of the Russians. This setback would not deter Afanasy. As they sailed through the Caspian Sea, a storm picked up, and the smaller ship carrying the other Russians was wrecked against the shores on the town of Tarku, and the people came out and captured the men. Afanasy knew they couldn't do anything yet, but if he waited he could get some help, so they kept going and eventually arrived in Durban, and Afanasy begged Hassan to intercede for those men captured in Tarku, and so Hassan sent a messenger to the Shah of Shawan, Farrukhsar, with the information, and immediately he sent a letter to the Prince of Kajtag, that controlled Tarku, that happened to be his brother, Khalil Beg, saying, "My ship was wrecked at Tarku and your men came and captured the men and stole their goods, and you should, for my sake, send the men to me and gather the merchandise because those men were sent in my name." Immediately, Khalil sent the men to Durban, and then to the Shah of Shawan, presumably wanting to avoid any sort of incident in a time of relative peace. Hassan, Afanasy, and the others followed in their footsteps, and once at the Shah, they begged him to help them through and back home, but Farrukhsar said he couldn't help them because there were simply too many of them. So leaving, a few of them decided to make their own way back. Some stayed in Shawan and worked, and some still went to nearby Baku to trade. But this would not deter Afanasy. He had heard that in Persia there was expensive fabrics unknown to the Russian market, and he refused to return empty-handed. He went to Baku with a few others, but unlike the others, he continued by himself. From here on out, Afanasy mostly travelled alone, through places he didn't know much about. He went to Chapakur on the southern coast of the Caspian Sea, where he stayed for 6 months. He doesn't write much down here, but likely he was learning some of the new customs and culture, and likely about the well-trod trading route he would take down the country, which started next with Sari, a larger town where he stayed for a month, then to Damavand and then to Ray. He then moved to Kashan, where he stayed for a month, a city noted by another European traveller, Barbaro, as a major silk centre where Afanasy likely started accruing some wealth. Then from Kashan to Nain, then to Yezd, where again he stayed for a month, and another town that Barbaro pointed out and said specifically it was a town of artificers as makers of silks, fustians, camlets, and other like. From there he went to Sajan and quickly then to Tarum, where he is amazed that the domestic animals are fed dates, and it's around here where he likely buys a horse that'll be his only companion for the journey. With his horse he rode to La, noted by Barbaro as a great and good town of merchandise. Then to the city of Hormuz. Recently, the entire city had moved to an island off the coast to avoid being pillaged by some nomads passing by. So Afanasy got on a little boat and started sailing to the usual endpoint for a European merchant travelling through Persia. As he travels there, he looks at the horizon, at what he calls the Sea of Hindustan, an old word for India, closing in on the trading capital that connected so much of the medieval world, where he would spend his first Easter away from home. Once he ports, he comments on the sun, saying it could burn a man. He remained here for a month, trading, making a lot of money, and in his time here he remembers something a Persian merchant told him in Yazd, that fine silks made their way from the city to and from a place far in Asia called India, and the main way to get there was on a boat from Hormuz. Looking at his pockets, he knew he could afford the trip. So, on April 4th, 1469, 2 days after Easter, he got on a boat with many others, embarking on a journey that would make him the first person to call themselves Russian to have stepped foot in India. From here he starts recording how long it takes to get from place to place, because he knew he was going to places that not many had gone before, and he was writing his travelogue most likely as a guide for merchants interested in these places, and Persia was relatively well known to Russian traders, but past that, nothing, so his notes here get a bit more precise, and he makes a few more observations. It takes 10 days to get to Muscat, then a further 4 days to get to Diu, and then to Cambay, where he comments on the amount of indigo that's produced. Then they spend 6 weeks sailing down the coast to Chaul. This starts what he considers, quote, Indian country, and his first few observations are, the people all go about naked, their heads are uncovered and their breasts are bare, and their hair is twisted in a single braid. The men and women are all black. I was followed by many people, they are amazed at a white man. And when he says white, let's consider that Tivier was on the same latitude as Denmark and Scotland, and the Russians were likely descendants of Scandinavians, so he was incredibly pale. Walking around this strange new place, he is next amazed by the garb of nobility. The person he calls their prince walks around with a cloth around his head and hips, likely dhoti, which at the time referred to a light cloth material common in India and surrounding areas. He notes the other nobles also wear this, and the princesses go about with a cloth draped over their shoulders and another about their hips, and the servants of the prince and of the nobles carry a shield and sword in their hands. He doesn't spend too much time in Chaul before riding on his horse 8 days to Pali, but passes straight through, spending 10 days getting to Umrah, which he also runs through to spend 6 days riding to get to Jinnah, which is built on a high crag, having to go up single file around the cliffs, and he observed that the commander of Jinnah was named Asad Khan, and he had 70,000 men, and that he worked under a person called Malakut Tajar, which is a title meaning Prince of Merchants. He also goes by the name Mahmud Gawan, who had 200,000 men in his army from as far as Arabia, and who had been warring with the non-Muslims for 20 years. He settled in Jinnah for a few months, and he started to experience the monsoon season for the first time, and he calls it the Indian winter. He stays in an inn and recommends other merchants do the same. Talking to the locals about the weather, he learns that for 4 months there's water and mud everywhere. A bit dismayed by this, but getting on, he goes to buy some food for his horse and writes a lot about what he finds. They feed horses on peas, kichiri, with sugar and oil, and in the morning they give horses rice cakes. He also learns that horses are not bred in India. Most people replace horses with oxen and buffalo. One day, whilst at the market with his horse, the commander, Asad Khan, takes notice of him and seems to have been observing him for a little while now, because he takes his horse and says, I will return your stallion and give you 1,000 gold pieces if you accept our faith, Islam. But if you do not accept our faith, Islam, I will take your stallion and 1,000 gold pieces on the forfeit of your head. And luckily for him, what Afanasy sees as a miracle, a man, Mahmud of Khorasan, arrives, a non-Indian Muslim who told off Asad Khan, and gave Afanasy his horse back and said that he shouldn't have forced Afanasy to change his faith. Afanasy dearly thanks a man as he rides away and thinks to himself before taking out some notes and writing some advice. Whoever of you wishes to go to the Indian country, let him leave his faith in Rus and call upon Muhammad. And it's around here where he realises his faith might be an issue in these lands and adopts a new name, Khoja Yusuf Khorasani, which means non-Indian follower of Ismailism, a branch of Shia Islam, who has been to Mecca. And he began to conceal his identity and took on one of a Caspian merchant and a Muslim. There's probably a bit of a time gap between this and the next entry where he appears to be struggling. He says, the Persians deceived me. They said I would find many goods suitable for us Russians, but there is nothing for our land. All the goods are expensive, only cheap for the Muslim. Only pepper and indigo are cheap. And there are many pirates on the sea. The non-Muslims plunder everything. They are neither Christian nor Muslim, but worship stone images. He would, however, not let this deter him, and he got on his horse and travelled to Bida, which he understood to be the Indians' largest city. It takes about a month to get there. In between, he comments on how many large cities India has, which would have been astonishing to him, who was mostly accustomed to small villages along the Volga. In Bida there is trade in horses, silk and many other goods, and in another fit of annoyance he says, "There are no goods for the Russian land, the people are evildoers and the women are prostitutes." After he cooled down a bit, he attended a military parade, or learn about them through someone else, where he comments that the nobles are always non-Indians, and the infantrymen are all Indians and were naked and barefooted. And the non-Indians in the army were on armoured horses, and he says, in battle they always use elephants, and on the elephants' tusks they tie large swords, and on their back is a howdah filled with armoured men carrying guns. Sometimes I forget how old guns are. The idea of, a middle 15th century Russian from a relatively small town watching multiple elephants with sword tusks being ridden by people armed with guns is awesome. Just awesome. And whilst here he learns about a massive fair held outside of the Muslim reaches in India, which he bookmarks for later. Every so often he spots or learns about a new unfamiliar creature, including some stories locals tell him that he accidentally takes as reality. 14 feet long snakes slithering along the streets. Seems real enough. Then a bird called the gukuk that flies at night and lashes fire out of its mouth, and a monkey prince with an army in the forest. Interesting. It's also very sadly here when he falls on some hard times. He travels to some surrounding towns to local markets that can't properly recover, and on a Christmas day that goes uncelebrated by anyone but him, he has to take his horse to the market to sell his only companion since he got to India. As he does, he looks again at the opulence the nobles have and the squalor the country people live in, the beauty of a palace in town that he calls very wonderful, but it's probably a cold comfort. He stayed here until Lent, where he befriended some local Hindus after he revealed that he was not Muslim, and that his name was Afanasy Nikitin, and they stopped hiding things from him such as their food, trade, or prayers. And he sat with them and learns that they worshipped idols, and there are 84 faiths in India that also believe in these idols, and that they don't eat beef. And after this conversation, they ask him to come with them on their journey to a holy place called Pavata, modern-day Shrisalem. Afanasy calls this their Jerusalem, or Mecca. He walks with them there, and they arrive after a month, where a fair is held for 5 days, and Afanasy, again amazed, says, "The idol house is indeed very large, about half the size of Tver, and it's made of stone with idols carved into it with depictions of their miracles." And again he spends a lot of time with the Hindus and comments, "Their fare is bad, and they hide from Muslims. If a Muslim looks at their food, they will not eat it." But after he spends more time, he seems to be off-put by their ways, commenting, "These oxen are called father and the cow mother. With their dung they bake bread and boil food, and with the ashes they paint their faces. In India, women are considered cheap and of little worth." It's also around here that he almost starts exclusively referring to God as Allah, and some passages are written in Turkic languages and others in Arabic written with Russian letters. Perhaps he was just assimilating to the culture of Islamic India, or perhaps he was changing internally. Either way, he quickly returns to Bida in 15 days for the Muslim festival that he calls Ulu Bayram, likely a misinterpretation of Kurban Bayrama. And as he returns, something starts to scare him. He doesn't know when Easter is. Easter as a holiday moves depending on the year, and he had been working that out every time when it came about, but as he reaches Bida, he starts to question his knowledge and writes, "I know neither Easter nor Christmas, neither Wednesday nor Friday," and for the first time in a while writes a Christian prayer in Russian, asking for protection. And that protection point is interesting because Afanasy was alone. The last great European traveller in these regions was probably Marco Polo, who came with a band of people, a travelling group that insulated him. As Afanasy closes this statement, he writes, "I am returning to Rus with the fort. Gone is my faith, I have fasted on Mohammedan fast days." It seems in this year he combined the fast dates and the fasting during daylight hours from Ramadan with the orthodox practice of not eating meat during Lent. He then spends many pages writing about the many cities in India and as far as Myanmar and South China. He didn't go to these places, but he was clearly talking to people who had, noting down the trading opportunities for future travellers, as well as how long it takes to get to each place. He returns after these pages to discussing his faith. "I have longed for my faith. Already 4 Lents have passed, yet I, sinful one, know not which day Easter is and which are fast days." There's a reprieve after this though, where he settles on a date he can call Easter and then describes something beautiful. In Muslim India, in the great city of Baida, I beheld the night before Easter. On Easter Sunday, the Pleiades and Orion arose at dawn and the Great Bear stood with his head towards the east. It's that night that seemingly he starts seriously considering going home, but he learns that whichever route he took, there was gonna be strife. Poison, leaders, or questions of faith. For example, he knows he could go home through Mecca, but he's aware that that would mean accepting Islam, but also staying in India was becoming too costly for him. But he manages to stick it out and writes a great many pages on the war efforts of Mahmud Ghawan, and even has a theological conversation with him where he admits he's saying 3 prayers a day, which was 2 less than what was required by Muslims, but 3 more than what was required by Orthodox Christianity, which had no minimum requirement. And in response, Mahmud said that he does not think Afanasy is a Muslim, but he also does not know the Christian faith. After writing this down, Afanasy writes his last prayer dedicated to the Christian God. On the 5th Easter, Afanasy finally starts his trek home with the sentence, "I broke my fast with them, the Muslims. I greeted Easter in Gulbarga." From Gulbarga, he went to Kalur, where he notes what's available for trade there, and he remained there for a few months, no doubt making some money, and then to Golconda, where there was a great market. Before continuing to the coast of India, Davao, he boarded a boat to Hormuz that stopped in Ethiopia, where he heard Muslim prayer and commented on its similarity to Russian prayer, perhaps in an effort to reconcile his Christian-Russian upbringing with his shift to a more undeniably Islamic style of religion that has persisted in his prayer, where he exclusively refers to Allah in Persian, despite leaving India where the Muslim veneer was needed to succeed as a merchant. He then gets to Muscat, Hormuz, Lar, Shiraz, Abaga, Yazd, Isfahan, Kashan, Qom, Save, Salanaf, and he starts to enter Christian lands, Tabriz and the Mongol horde at Diarbekir, then to Trebizond, where he arrived on October 14th, 1472, 6 years since he'd been home, and he was about to cross into Europe. Storms made his way through the Black Sea difficult, ending up at Trebizond again several times, but eventually the weather is right and he crosses, and as he does he writes, "Allah is just, Allah is the Lord and Protector." He arrives in Feodosia in Crimea. He then joins a few other merchants and starts marching up to Smolensk, 200 miles from home. But his writing ends in Feodosia because he didn't make it to Smolensk. His last written words in the first translation are, "By the memory of God, I have crossed the 3 seas, the rest God alone knows, God the Protector alone what." But that's a lie. His last words were erased. In the original text, his last words were a page-long prayer dedicated to Allah, written in Arabic using Cyrillic characters, the second he stepped on Christian soil for the first time in 6 years. This is the only instance we have of a Russian text at the time ending with a Muslim prayer, because I think it's undeniable in his time Afanasy had started mostly identifying with Muslims and felt detached from his orthodoxy. But this was erased, in a frankly disgusting attempt from people to change his identity for their own purposes. If he, at the start of his journey, had gotten to Nizhny Novgorod 2 weeks earlier, and went on the journey down to the Caucasus with Vasily Papin instead of Hassan Beg, he wouldn't have got robbed. And he likely wouldn't have justified going further away from home again and again. He would never have went on his voyage, and likely he wouldn't have died on the way back. Afanasy probably would have wanted to edit this before it was seen by the world. This is a lot of raw text and emotion. He died before he properly got the chance to organise it. It's even been said that the manuscript we have is a combination of the travelogue as well as private notes, which seems pretty possible to me given the way that the text dances around and talks about very private things. Highly recommend you guys read this text. Check the description for all the sources. But that's all. Bye bye.